My name is Elise Pennington. I'm 29 years old. I'm a portrait photographer specializing in natural light and stories people don't usually tell. In my family, that makes me the assistant. I grew up around artists, big names, legacy builders. My parents, both alumni of the New York School of Art, met at a gallery opening and spent the next 30 years convincing the world they were visionaries and that their children were born into brilliance. And maybe one of us was. Adrianne, my older sister, sculpts on commission for national museums. Bronze, marble, concrete, doesn't matter. Whatever she touches turns into a press release. She's bold, breathtaking, brilliant, and she knows it. Me? I spent the last 5 years photographing shadows. Literally. My last personal exhibit, Negative Spaces, featured a series of black and white stills from abandoned buildings across Louisiana. No coverage, no clicks. My parents didn't attend. They said they were between donors. And yet, here I am again. Camera bag slung over one shoulder, neutral dress, comfortable heels, Adrianne's solo show. Another opening night, another set of perfectly lit press interviews. And I'm not even holding a glass of champagne. I'm holding a backup battery pack. This, my father says into a reporter's microphone, gesturing to the centerpiece of the room, a 9-foot phoenix sculpted mid-flight from molten bronze, is not just sculpture. This is America's future in art. And Adrianne, well, she's the soul of it. I stand by a column near the emergency exit, blinking against the gallery lights. He says it like it's prophecy, and everyone nods. My mother waves over one of the curators with a saccharine smile. We're so grateful you featured our daughter's work. Her creative voice, it's just so refined, so generous. Isn't it rare to find someone so giving in this industry? I hear that word, giving, and nearly laugh. Giving? Adrianne hasn't returned a phone call in 4 months. She showed up an hour late to her own documentary shoot and left halfway through because the lighting wasn't warm enough for her cheekbones. The irony? I was the one behind the camera. I've been the one behind the camera for most of my life. Whenever Adrianne needed process videos, I filmed. When she needed grant applications polished, I proofread. When she got a solo residency in Paris, guess who booked the flights? But to them, I'm still the quiet one, the logistical one, the one who knows her place. And yet, I kept showing up. Some part of me still believed that if I helped enough, stayed useful enough, they might see me. I take a step toward the side hallway, gripping my camera strap. I can't watch this again. But just as I turn, my mother calls out, "Elise, there you are! You should consider taking a business course. You're great with emails. Maybe branding would suit you better than whatever it is you're doing now." I don't flinch. I just nod once, small enough not to interrupt the conversation she's already turned back to. And if you've made it this far into my story, pause just for a second and hit subscribe, like, or share this video with someone who's ever felt invisible in their own family. Because the truth is, people like me, we're everywhere, behind the lens, behind the curtain, behind the applause. But sometimes, the story turns. There's a murmur spreading through the gallery now, a shift in the air. It starts near the back wall, where a linen-covered canvas stands alone. I hadn't noticed it before. No signage, no artist's name. The gallery's co-director steps up to the podium with a microphone in hand. Her voice is low, controlled. A hush rolls over the room like fog. Before we close this evening's presentation, we have one final piece to reveal. This one was added per special instruction, left to us by the late Margot Pennington, whose artistic legacy shaped not only this gallery, but the very spirit of this city's art scene. My breath catches. Margot, my grandmother, my light. It's been almost a year since she passed. I wasn't told about the funeral until 6 days after it happened. The excuse? You were busy. Overseas. I was in New Jersey, on a freelance job. The lights dim slightly, drawing every gaze to the covered canvas. My mother stiffens. My father's mouth forms a line. Adrianne sets her wine glass down without sipping. I take one quiet step closer. The co-director lifts the linen cloth. It's a black and white photograph. Large, framed in raw pine, Margot, in her final weeks. Her eyes, piercing and wild with memory, her hair unbrushed, wispy with age, her hands, clay-stained and shaking, still reaching for a half-formed sculpture. There's a caption in the corner. I know the typeface. Taken by Elise Pennington. Silence. And then, Margot left instructions that this piece be unveiled tonight, the co-director continues. And more importantly, that her private studio, works in progress, handwritten journals, and associated trust funds be transferred in full ownership to her granddaughter, Elise Pennington. A ripple of sound, gasps, whispers, an audible scoff from somewhere behind me. My mother's expression turns to stone. My father's eyes flick toward Adrianne. And Adrianne, she just stares at the photo like it's cursed. I don't move. I can't. My hands tremble just enough that I have to hold the camera to steady them. The air is thin now. The room no longer sees me as invisible. They see me, finally, but not how they expected, and certainly not how they planned. Applause rippled across the room like applause always does when people don't quite understand what they're clapping for. Adrianne stood beside the bronze phoenix, flawless under the spotlight. Her hands rested delicately in front of her, one finger brushing the edge of the sculpture like she was born from it. Cameras clicked. Guests leaned in. Champagne refilled itself. I stayed near the back wall, right between the catering table and the hallway leading to the restrooms, just close enough to see, just far enough to disappear. The curator raised her glass. Tonight, we honor not only Adrianne Pennington's talent, but her fearless contribution to the language of modern sculpture. This work, Resurrect, is more than an installation. It's a statement. People nodded like they understood what that meant. My father beamed. She's always been singular. Even in preschool, she sculpted with sand while other kids chewed crayons. My mother chuckled. We knew she had it. We just had to clear the path. They always said it like they were the ones who carved her success, like their support came in brushstrokes of brilliance, instead of expensive prep schools and perfectly timed press leaks. They never spoke that way about me. Not after I dropped out of the Rhode Island School of Design, not after I turned down a brand contract for travel photography, and definitely not after I started teaching workshops at a local shelter instead of applying to grad school. How long do you plan to keep freelancing? That's what my mother asked me last Thanksgiving. While slicing a tart, Adrianne didn't bake. At some point, you'll want something real, something stable, a job where people know your name. I'd smiled then, tired, like someone who had run out of synonyms for I'm doing fine. Back at the gallery, the buzz grew louder. A few guests were already lining up to take selfies beside Adrianne and the Phoenix, careful not to get too close and trigger the motion sensors. I watched as a little girl, maybe 10, tugged on her mother's coat. Did that lady make it all by herself? Her mom nodded. The girl frowned. What does it mean? Her mother hesitated. Then, it means she's strong. She rose from something, like a bird made of fire. The girl squinted at the sculpture again, unimpressed. But it doesn't look happy. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I picked up my camera and adjusted the lens. It was muscle memory by now. ISO, aperture, shutter, framing Adrianne's silhouette between the metallic wings, capturing reflections on polished concrete, pretending it mattered to someone other than the magazine editor who'd never credit me by name. That's when the gallery co-director stepped onto the podium. She was calm, too calm. Something had shifted. Before we close the evening, we have one final piece to share, she said. It was submitted posthumously by one of our city's most beloved artists. As per her final wishes, this piece was to be revealed tonight, no earlier, no later. People turned, confused. There wasn't supposed to be a final piece. The program said nothing. I looked up. At the far end of the room, behind a velvet rope and an antique easel, stood a covered canvas, linen, slightly wrinkled. I hadn't noticed it before. Neither had most people. It wasn't lit dramatically. It wasn't even in frame. The director walked over and gently removed the cover. And there she was. Margot Pennington, captured in sharp grayscale, hair wild, hands stained with clay, eyes alive with stubborn wonder. My grandmother, in her final days, immortalized not by bronze or stone, but by light, my light. I remembered taking that photo, a quiet morning in her studio. We hadn't spoken much. She'd just looked at me and said, "Don't try to fix the truth. Just show it." Beneath the image was a simple caption, photographed by Elise Pennington. Silence. You could hear someone set their glass down a little too hard. The co-director's voice steadied. Margot also left clear legal instructions. Her personal studio, artistic estate, original works, research journals, and full trust are to be transferred to Elise Pennington. Furthermore, the studio will be converted into a center for artistic development for students from non-traditional and underrepresented backgrounds, effective immediately. My mother gasped audibly. Adrianne's fingers curled around the edge of a cocktail napkin, squeezing until it tore. My father's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. And me? I stood still, entirely still, like someone had just pulled the curtain on a stage I forgot I was standing on. My throat was dry, not with fear, but recognition. I wasn't waiting to be seen anymore. I had been seen, by the one person who'd always known where to look. When the clapping finally started, it was cautious, hesitant, polite enough to be obligatory. I didn't hear it. My mind was already elsewhere, somewhere dustier, quieter, lit by northern windows and the smell of linseed oil. The place where her hands had shaped meaning out of silence. Her studio. My studio now. The gallery emptied slowly. Some guests lingered near the refreshment table, unsure whether they should still be sipping wine. Others whispered in corners, eyes darting between me and the now uncovered photograph like something dangerous might erupt. The clinking of glasses had stopped. Even the lights seemed quieter. Adrianne hadn't moved. She stood frozen, her heels locked into the floor, arms tightly crossed. Her jaw shifted slightly, as if she were chewing on a thought too bitter to swallow. My mother broke the silence first. "This must be a mistake," she said, voice sharp but thin. "Margot wouldn't do something like this without telling us." My father cleared his throat, adjusting his tie, his go-to ritual when he was trying to look composed. "We should speak to the gallery director. Clarify the interpretation." But the gallery co-director had already stepped aside, replaced by someone I hadn't seen in years. "There's nothing to clarify." The voice came from the hallway. I turned. Mr. Glenn Abernathy, Margot's estate lawyer, stepped into the room, briefcase in hand, eyes like steel beneath silver glasses. He'd aged, but he still moved like every word he spoke would be recorded in court. "The directives are clear. They were signed, notarized, and delivered to both the gallery and my office months before her passing. There is no ambiguity." He stopped next to the photograph and opened his briefcase. "There's one more thing." From inside, he removed a worn envelope sealed with deep red wax. My breath caught at the handwriting on the front. "To be read aloud, in the presence of family," he said. "Margot's instruction." My mother stepped forward. "That's not necessary, really. If this is about the will—" "It's not," Mr. Abernathy cut in. "It's about intention." He broke the seal cleanly and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The room held its breath. "To my family," he began, reading Margot's handwriting in a voice both gentle and absolute. "And to Elise, especially Elise, if you're hearing this, I'm gone. But I haven't left without saying what needed saying." My legs weakened. I reached out and rested my hand on the back of a bench. Adrianne shifted her weight and finally looked at me, for the first time all night. Not with contempt, with fear. "Adrianne," the letter continued, "you were the one they understood. You performed the part with grace, and you should be proud of that. But Elise, you were the one who listened, the one who waited for light before pressing the shutter, the one who saw me when I was no longer being sculpted but simply being." The air snapped. Adrianne blinked hard. Mr. Abernathy didn't pause. "Elise," he read, "this is for you, not because you needed recognition, but because you never asked for it. You captured my spirit when it was fraying. You let me be flawed, fading, unfinished, and still found beauty. The back of my throat tightened. I never forgot how you sat on that broken stool when you were 12, notebook on your knees, asking how Clay remembers. You never needed approval, you just needed permission. And I am giving it now, in full, with all I have. Silence. This isn't inheritance. This is continuation. Take the studio. Take the trust. Take the notebooks. Build something I couldn't, for the ones they'll overlook next. Mr. Abernathy folded the letter slowly, reverently. No one spoke. Then my mother whispered, brittle and stunned, She gave it all to her." Adrianne let out a low, bitter laugh. Of course she did. I turned to her. For once, I didn't flinch. What's that supposed to mean? She met my gaze, eyes red-rimmed but hard. It means she gave it to the one who never had to fight for attention, because you made it your whole identity to be quiet. I stared at her. And you made it yours to be seen. That wasn't my choice. You were always the favorite, she snapped. You just hid it better. No, I said, voice even. I was just there. And she noticed. My father finally stepped forward, voice low. We supported you both. Don't turn this into some emotional revisionism. I shook my head. You supported her career. You tolerated my existence. That's not the same thing. My mother opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Just breath. Just silence. It hit me then. This wasn't about the will. It wasn't even about the studio. It was about the things none of them had ever said, and the things I had stopped waiting to hear. I looked back at the photo. Margot's face lit by soft window light, her fingers caught mid-gesture, alive with story, and beneath it, my name. Not hidden, not in the fine print, but right there. It wasn't revenge, it was acknowledgement, and that, finally, was enough. That night, after the guests had cleared and the gallery lights dimmed, I walked alone through the parking lot, my boots echoing on the stone. I didn't call a cab, I didn't message anyone, I just kept walking. Toward a destination I hadn't seen in almost a year. Margot's studio, the place that once smelled like clay, coffee, and camellias. The place I'd once asked to stay the night in, just to soak in the light. Now it was mine, not as a prize, as a beginning. It was nearly midnight by the time I reached the docks. The air had a weight to it, thick with salt, soft with fog. Every footstep echoed in that lonely hour. The world was asleep, except me. I wasn't sure if I'd closed my eyes since the gallery. Margot's studio sat on the edge of the old industrial district, tucked between a defunct shipyard and a bakery that still opened at dawn. A long warehouse, modest from the street, with skylights stretched across its rusted roof and ivy clawing up its brick facade like time trying to hold on. The iron gate let out a groan as I pushed it open. It hadn't been oiled in years. I hesitated at the door. I had spent summers here, curled up on the wooden floor with a sketch pad while Margot hummed along to jazz records, her fingers always in motion. She smelled like turpentine and lemon tea. She spoke like everything mattered, but nothing was permanent. And now she was gone. I pressed my hand to the key panel. Mr. Abernathy had given me the code earlier. 4 numbers. The year I was born. The lock clicked. I stepped inside. It smelled the same. Dust, clay, old wood, dried eucalyptus from the wreath she refused to throw out. The space was massive. 2 stories of open ceilings and pale light from the moon spilling through the glass. Workbenches still stood in rows, brushes stiff with age, half-used glazes lined up like soldiers. Against the far wall, her last sculpture, unfinished, a bust of a woman with closed eyes and broken shoulders, a mirror of strength and surrender. I moved slowly, afraid to touch anything. My boots creaked across the old floorboards, the same ones I used to crawl across with chalk-stained knees. Near the front window sat the stool I once stood on to photograph her hands. It hadn't moved, and then I saw it, taped to the wall, just above the bookshelf. A photograph. Me. 12 years old, camera in hand, wide smile, hair pulled back in 2 uneven braids. The image was printed on matte paper, slightly faded, but I recognized it immediately. I hadn't seen that photo in over a decade. A note beneath it, written in her uneven script. She sees what others don't. Let her. I sank onto the bench beside the bookshelf. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't grief. It was something heavier, something between guilt and awe. She had seen me, long before I knew how to see myself. I found her notebooks in the top drawer of her old writing desk, dozens of them, bound in leather and tied with string. Some were filled with sketches, others were lined with questions, existential, artistic, playful. One page read, "Why do people think permanence means value? Clay holds more truth in its cracks." Another, "Elise asked today if light has memory. I told her yes. I wasn't lying." I covered my mouth with my hand. I remembered that day. I'd been testing light exposure with my first real camera. The sun had kept slipping behind clouds, and I was frustrated. She'd sat beside me, wiped the lens with her apron, and said, "Light remembers what it touches. You just have to be patient enough to catch it." I had always thought she was being poetic. Now I wondered if she'd meant it. In the far corner of the studio, beneath the loft where she used to sleep, was a storage trunk I had never seen opened. It took me a minute to jimmy the old latch. Inside were boxes labeled with my name. My name. Inside them, rolls of undeveloped film, my earliest negatives, copies of my high school zines. The rejection letter from RISD I had ripped up and thrown in the trash. She had taped it back together. She'd saved all of it, not because she pitied me, because she believed in the parts I'd tried to forget. I sat on the floor, surrounded by my past, fragments of a version of me I didn't even know had been preserved. The kind of version you only recognize when someone else remembers it for you. When the sun began to rise, it did so slowly, spilling pale orange light through the skylights. It touched the photo on the wall first, then spread across the floor like a gentle exhale. I stood and walked to the center of the studio, closed my eyes, inhaled, and whispered, "I'm home." But I knew this wasn't just about coming back. It was about beginning again, with permission, with purpose, with nothing left to prove. Margot hadn't handed me a spotlight. She'd handed me a key. The second night in the studio, I didn't sleep. I tried. I laid on the old cot tucked beneath the loft, the same place Margot used to nap after sculpting for hours. But my thoughts ran loops. Even with all the light filtering in from the skylights above, something about the air felt unfinished. Like the room knew something I didn't yet. Just past 2 a.m., I got up and made tea. The kettle wheezed like it hadn't been used in months. Dust still clung to the spice rack near the sink. A half-empty jar of honey, crusted around the rim, waited patiently beside a chipped mug I recognized. It used to be mine. I'd painted sunflowers on it with ceramic markers when I was 13. She'd kept it here all this time. While the tea steeped, I opened one of Margot's smaller notebooks, thin and frayed, with a single elastic band holding it together. Inside, a list of numbers in her handwriting, dated by month. Each entry had a time, a duration, and next to it, no answer. Some had my name beside them. 4:17, 2:04 p.m., no answer, Elise. 4:22, voicemail, Elise. 5:3, no ring, line blocked? The last one stung. Line blocked? I grabbed my phone from the counter and stared at my call log, scrolling back as far as I could. I'd never changed my number. Not since college, not even once. And I remembered, one afternoon in March, I'd driven by her studio. I'd knocked. No one had answered. When I texted Adrianne afterward to ask if Margot was away, she wrote back, "She's tired, doesn't want visitors, best to leave it be." I had believed her. My stomach turned. Back in the loft, I opened the desk drawer, hoping to find something else to distract me. Instead, I found a stack of envelopes, letters I'd sent over the years, birthday cards, holiday photos, even the small print I mailed after my first gallery rejection. All unopened. They'd been forwarded. The return addresses were scratched out with someone else's handwriting. My parents. My sisters. Every piece marked "no longer at this address," even though Margot had never moved. My pulse started to thrum. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was intentional. They didn't want her to see me, or me to see her. They didn't just forget to tell me she was sick. They made sure I wouldn't know. I sat down on the floor, the pile of unopened envelopes in my lap, and just stared. Not crying, just stunned. The betrayal didn't roar. It whispered. Through slashed return labels, through no answer scribbled in the margins, through a mug with fading paint that had still earned a spot on her shelf. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call someone and demand an explanation. But who would I even call? The people who did this wouldn't admit it. And Margot was gone. All I had left were the pieces she didn't erase. The next morning I stood by the window, sipping cold tea, watching the sunlight spill across the floor like it was trying to apologize for yesterday. There was a tap at this glass. A bird, blue, small, perched on the ledge, head tilted. I watched it for a moment. It flew off, leaving a faint feather behind. Even that felt like a message. I turned back to the wall and looked again at my photograph. The 12-year-old version of me, squinting into the camera, completely unaware of the storm she'd one day walk through. "They lied to you," I said out loud. Not to the photo, not to Margot, to myself. "They made you think I didn't care, and they made me think you didn't want me." My voice cracked, just a little. That hurt more than any gallery snub, more than being ignored on every holiday. They hadn't just sidelined me, they'd rewritten the story. But Margot, she'd documented the truth. And now I had it. That night I didn't lay on the cot. I sat at her old drafting table with one of her empty notebooks and started to write. Not an email, not a caption, not a grant application. Just truth, one line at a time. The sun was barely up when I called Rosa. She answered on the third ring, still groggy. "Elise, is everything okay?" I paused, letting the silence stretch until the words felt true. "I think I know what I'm supposed to do with the studio." Rosa didn't press. She never did. That's why I'd called her. "You want to tell me, or you want me to just show up with coffee?" "Both," I said. 2 hours later, we sat cross-legged on the studio floor, surrounded by stacks of Margot's materials, canvases, sculpting tools, and a few unopened boxes that still smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. Rosa sipped from a thermos labeled, "Caffeine is a muse," her black curls pulled into a messy knot. "You're thinking of keeping it?" she asked gently. "Not as a museum. That's what they probably expect me to do. Preserve it. Make it holy, untouchable." I looked around the space, now glowing with morning light. But this place wasn't meant to be frozen. It was alive. It taught. It breathed. It told the truth in ways my family never could. Rosa nodded slowly, letting me take my time. "I want to open it," I said. "To kids who don't get to belong in places like this." "Art therapy?" "Art truth." I smiled for the first time in days. "I want to build a space where they don't need to prove they matter before being allowed to create." I stood up, moving toward the far wall, the one that used to hold Margot's rotating display of student sketches. "We'll call it the Forgotten Frame." "That sounds like a gallery." "Exactly. Because every kid who walks in here deserves to see their work on a wall." Rosa whistled low. "That's a hell of a purpose." I shrugged. "It's overdue." That afternoon we began clearing the space. Carefully, respectfully, but without worship. Margot would have hated that. She used to say, "Studios aren't churches, don't kneel, get messy." We sorted her work, archived the finished pieces, photographed the incomplete ones, and made a corner shrine of her favorite tools. I boxed up the old rejection letters I'd found and labeled the bin, proof we kept going. By evening, the air had shifted. It no longer smelled like memory, it smelled like potential. The next day, I put out a call for volunteers. Nothing dramatic. Just a small post online. Transforming a legacy into something loud, inclusive, and real. Looking for artists, organizers, and believers. If you've ever felt like you didn't belong, maybe you belong here. Within 48 hours, I had 10 responses. By the end of the week, 30. A muralist named Kyle offered to repaint the exterior. A sculptor from Tacoma asked if she could donate some unused clay. A teacher I hadn't spoken to in years sent me 10 refurbished easels from his high school storage room. And then came the kids, not in waves, but in pairs. A girl whose father said drawing was a waste of time. A boy who only ever doodled during detention. A sibling duo who made paper sculptures from junk mail. They were quiet at first, shoulders tense, eyes uncertain. But then we handed them charcoal, light meters, disposable cameras. And the studio started to breathe again. On the 10th day, I stood at the entrance, watching 2 students, Amber and Zay, pin their sketches to the gallery wall we'd turned into an ever-growing collage. They were both 13, both skeptical, both brilliant. Amber turned to me and asked, "Do we get to keep our stuff up there?" "As long as you want," I said, "even if it's not, perfect?" "Especially then." She stared at me for a second, then nodded and walked back to her corner of the studio, clutching a graphite pencil like it was armor. I looked around, at the mismatched furniture, the laughter echoing down the hall, the paint stains already smudging the floor Margot once mopped every Saturday, and I felt it. This was no longer about what my family took from me. It was about what I was building in spite of it. Not a monument. A movement. A place where the unseen become undeniable. The real work didn't begin with a ribbon cutting. It began with a mess. By the 3rd week, the floor was a riot of muddy boot prints and dried acrylic. The brushes had gone stiff from someone forgetting to rinse them. The back hallway reeked of turpentine and middle school body spray. And still, every morning at 8:45, I unlocked the door to the forgotten frame and let them in. 15 students, ages 10 to 17. A wild, brilliant, chaotic crew. They came from everywhere, shelters, foster homes, underfunded charter schools. Some had parents who dropped them off and waved nervously. Others showed up alone, eyes sharp with distrust, hoodies pulled tight like armor. None of them had ever stepped inside a real studio before. And honestly, neither had I. Sure, I'd spent years behind the camera, but teaching, guiding, holding space for someone else's creation instead of documenting it, that was new territory. Ooh. On day 1, I gave them each a sketchbook. Not store-bought. I'd hand-bound them the night before with leftover photo paper and twine. Each one stamped with a phrase Margot used to say, "Draw what they overlook." Some laughed. Some rolled their eyes. One kid, Zay, muttered, "What if they overlook me?" I looked at him and said, "Then we'll draw you until they can't." He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. It was a start. The early days were messy, and not just in the literal sense. One afternoon, a 12-year-old named Juno threw her watercolors in the trash and slammed her sketchbook shut. I suck. I always suck. I sat beside her, not touching the paper, just watching. "What makes you think that?" I asked. "My dad said art is for people who don't have real problems." I wanted to scream. Instead, I reached into my satchel and pulled out a photo I'd taken years ago, black and white, grainy, of a cracked window in an abandoned farmhouse. Margot had loved that one. "See this?" I said. "This shot took me 2 seconds. But what you drew, that took courage. That's real." She looked at me, eyes red but alert. "You mean that?" "I mean every word." She didn't speak again, but she retrieved the painting from the trash. And just like that, little by little, the room began to change. Amber started asking for extra charcoal so she could practice shadows after dark. Zay brought in a broken keyboard and composed background music for the gallery space. Juno painted a mural of an open mouth with no teeth and called it Grin Without Permission. They were becoming artists before they even realized it. And I, somehow, was becoming a version of myself I'd long buried. Not the silent sibling, not the designated documentarian, just Elise showing up. Elise. Showing, present, unafraid to take up space. Late one Friday, long after the students had gone home, I stayed behind to clean the sink. It was crusted with dried pigment, pinks and blues hardened like candy shells. The mop leaned useless in the corner. I should have gone home. Instead, I wandered toward the wall we'd turned into the spotlight strip, a rotating display of student work. Some pieces were scribbles, others were stunning. All were raw, honest, unmistakably theirs. In the center, Amber had tacked up a new page. It read, "I used to feel invisible. Now my name is on a wall." Beneath it, she'd signed her name. I pressed my hand to the cool drywall beside it, then let it fall. The silence around me was soft, but full. Not the kind of silence I'd grown up in, the one packed with judgment and unsaid disappointment. This was different. This was rest. This was real. Rosa stopped by later with Thai food and chamomile tea. We sat cross-legged on the floor, the way we used to in college, our backs to the paint-splattered shelves. She looked around the space, at the workstations, the hanging lights, the kids' drawings pinned to every exposed beam. "You did this," she said. I shook my head. "We did this. They did this." She gave me a look. "You can say it, you know." "Say what?" "That you're proud, that you're allowed to be proud." The words caught in my throat, not because I didn't believe them, because I finally did. Later that night, I walked the length of the studio alone. The moonlight cast long, soft lines across the floor. I turned out the lights one by one, letting the darkness gather like ink. When I reached the front door, I paused. One last glance back. The sketchbooks stacked neatly, the walls echoing with color, the memory of laughter still floating in the air. This wasn't just a classroom, it was a home. Not for what I had lost, but for what I was learning to build. The rain came in sideways that morning. I was setting up for a Saturday workshop when the storm rolled in. Soft at first, then relentless. Wind smacked against the skylights. Paintings fluttered on the cork wall like nervous birds. Amber and Juno were already bickering over brush sizes, and Zay was testing a mic he'd rigged into a makeshift podcast booth by the kiln room. It was chaos, but the kind I'd grown to love. I was halfway through taping a cord to the floor when the front door creaked open. I looked up, expecting Rosa or maybe the muralist dropping in early. But it wasn't them. It was Adrianne. She stood just inside the threshold, soaked through, her navy coat hanging too loose on her frame. No heels, no makeup. Her hair was pulled back into a low bun, and her hands were jammed deep into her coat pockets, like she wasn't sure whether to hide or defend herself. For a moment, no one moved. She blinked at the room. The kids, the paint, the noise, the smell of instant coffee and linseed oil, and then at me. "I didn't know what to expect," she said. Her voice was quieter than I remembered. Less performative, still crisp, but stripped of its usual polish. I didn't say anything. I was too aware of the silence that had suddenly swept over the room. Amber tugged at my sleeve. "Is that your sister?" "Yeah," I said, without looking away. "That's Adrianne." Adrianne offered a half smile to no one in particular. "I just wanted to see it, the place, what you've done with it." She took a tentative step forward. I didn't stop her. "It's open to the public on weekends," I said evenly. "We're between sessions right now. You're welcome to walk around." She nodded once, then wandered. No ceremony, no speeches, just quiet steps across the paint-splattered floor. I watched her trace the studio's bones like she was trying to read a story written in dust and color. She paused by the wall of student sketches, her eyes lingering on Zay's photo essay titled "My Block in Color." Then she wandered past the refurbished darkroom, stopping at a watercolor of a crumbling house with the caption, "What's Left Behind?" She didn't say much, just breathed the room in like she didn't quite know how to process it. Finally, near the back, beneath a string of exposed bulbs and dried eucalyptus bunches, she turned to me. "I didn't know," she said. "Didn't know what?" "That it would feel like this. I don't know what I thought." She looked away. "I expected posters, rules, maybe a portrait of Margot in a gold frame." I almost laughed. "She'd haunt me if I did that." "She would," Adrianne agreed, lips twitching just slightly. "She used to say gold frames were insecure." The familiarity of that memory cracked something inside me, but I didn't let it show. "Why now?" I asked. "Why come today?" She hesitated. "Because I haven't stopped thinking about that letter. The one he read at the gallery, the words, the part about you seeing what others miss." I stayed quiet. She stepped closer, but still left space between us. "I was angry at first. I thought she gave it to you out of pity. Because you were quieter. Because you didn't fight back. But I've been thinking. Maybe she saw something in you I couldn't. I swallowed hard. That's not news to me, Adrianne. That's 20 years too late. She winced, and for a moment I saw it. The crack in the armor. The tremble she'd never let me see as kids. I know, she said, but I'm here now. I just wanted to see it, what you built. The workshop noise picked back up behind us. Amber's laugh, Zay's voice testing audio levels again, Juno yelling, "Don't touch my brushes!" Adrianne glanced toward the sound. They look alive in here. They are, I said. That's kind of the point. She smiled. This one didn't feel rehearsed. You should be proud. I am. She nodded again, slower this time. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It's nothing fancy, just something I wrote, a communication guide for kids who get nervous. Thought it might help. Or not, either way. She handed it to me, awkwardly, like she half expected me to throw it away. I didn't. I took it. Read the title. Say it anyway. Notes for the quiet ones. Something tightened in my chest. Thank you, I said, honest and low. You don't have to forgive me, she replied. I wouldn't even know what that looks like. I don't, I said. But I see you. Her eyes shone with something close to relief, or maybe just recognition. That's more than I thought I'd get. She looked around the room one last time. Do you need help organizing anything? I can sort supplies. I'm good at structure, remember? I didn't answer right away, but eventually I nodded toward the storage closet. Brushes, third shelf, just don't touch Juno's brushes. She'll kill you. Adrianne gave a breathy laugh and walked toward the back. And just like that, without apology, without a hug, without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, my sister stayed. Not because she was asked to, because something in her wanted to. Adrianne came back the following Saturday. No announcement, no dramatic entrance, just the sound of the front door opening during cleanup, followed by a familiar rustle of her coat and the click of her boots on the studio floor. This time she brought coffee, 2 cups, one labeled for the one who always showed up. She didn't say it was for me. She didn't need to. I took the cup without a word. Our fingers brushed for half a second, that was all. It had been 4 weeks since her first visit. Since then, she'd returned twice. Once to drop off laminated copies of her student communication guide, once just to sweep up after a sculpture demo and leave without speaking to anyone. She never stayed long, never lingered. But she came. And somehow, that meant more than if she'd shown up with flowers and a rehearsed apology. That afternoon, we hosted our first student-led showcase. We'd strung paper lanterns from the rafters, pushed tables into makeshift gallery pods, and hung student portraits in the order they requested, not by best or most polished, but by emotion, by story, by connection. Each student introduced their work in their own way, some with trembling voices, others through pre-recorded messages. Amber recited a poem. Zay performed a monologue with the lights dimmed low. The studio pulsed with pride and nerves and shaky courage. Near the back wall, Adrianne stood quietly, watching it all. She kept to herself, arms crossed, eyes scanning each piece slowly, intently. She didn't offer commentary. She didn't take over. For once in her life, she wasn't curating the moment. She was present in it. After the presentations, the students drifted toward the refreshment table, chattering and laughing. I stood by the gallery wall, pretending to adjust one of the photos, when Adrianne approached. She looked at the framed sketch nearest us, a jagged pencil drawing of a crowded bus, claustrophobic and buzzing with details. This one, she said, it feels like anxiety. It is, I replied. Juno drew it after her first therapy session, said it reminded her of waiting for news you're scared to hear. Adrianne nodded, eyes still on the drawing. You taught them to be brave, she said softly. It wasn't a compliment. It was acknowledgement, the kind I'd spent a lifetime craving. No, I said. I gave them space. They did the rest. She exhaled, then turned to face me. You know I didn't see it. Any of it. For years I thought you were hiding, that you didn't want to be seen. I met her eyes. Because you only looked where the light was. Her expression faltered. Yeah, she said. Yeah, I did. The silence between us wasn't sharp this time. It settled like dust, soft, slow, inevitable. Adrianne reached into her bag and handed me a folder. Another draft, she said. The guide. I added sections. One on stage fright, another on speaking through art instead of words. Might be useful. I flipped it open. Handwritten edits lined the margins, notes in red ink, sample scripts, even a few stick figure illustrations, messy, awkward, entirely sincere. You've been working on this. Yeah. For the kids? She hesitated. For them. And maybe for the kid I was, too. That stopped me. She shifted her weight and looked down. I'm not good at saying sorry, she said. You know that. I know. But I'm here. I know that, too. Another beat of silence. Do you think they like me? She asked suddenly. The students, I mean. They don't trust easily, I said. But they notice consistency. Show up and they'll show up back. She smiled, just barely. I'll keep showing up then. And she did. Over the next few weeks, Adrianne began leading short afternoon sessions. Nothing elaborate, just quick warm-ups in posture and presence. How to introduce your work without shrinking. How to read the room when your voice shakes. How to own your space without apologizing. The students adored her. They called her Coach V, short for voice, not vanity, she joked. She never tried to lead the program. She just added to it, quietly, honestly, without pretending to be the hero. One night, I found a new folder on my desk. Inside, a printed version of the guide, now professionally formatted. A sticky note on the cover read, You made the place. I just helped paint the sign. No name. No flourish. Just a gesture. A bridge. I stood in the middle of the studio, the guide in hand, and let the moment settle. No, she hadn't said I'm sorry. She didn't need to. Because she finally understood what this was. Not a monument to grief, but a canvas for something new, and that, finally, was enough. It was a Thursday evening, the kind of spring dusk that slips in quietly, honeyed light falling across the floorboards, long shadows stretching between easels and supply carts. Most of the students had gone home, their laughter still lingering in the walls like echoes of something sacred. I was restocking the charcoal drawer when I saw it. A folder. Thick, crisp edges. Left neatly on the corner of my desk, weighed down with a single smooth river stone. One I recognized from Margot's garden path. No note this time, but I didn't need one. I sat down, peeled the cover open, and read the title printed in bold across the front page. Say It Anyway, a communication guide for the quiet ones. Compiled and annotated by Adrianne Pennington. For a moment, I just stared. Not at the title, but at the name. It was the first time I'd seen hers appear on anything that didn't sparkle with self-promotion. No monogrammed branding, no artistic logo, just her name, Ernest, unadorned. I flipped to the first page. This guide is for the students who speak in glances, for the ones who raise their hands halfway, then lower them again. For those whose hearts race faster when asked to introduce themselves than when asked to dream. My throat tightened. It wasn't just informative, it was personal. Sections were titled like small conversations. How to start before you're ready. Body language for when you want to vanish. Reclaiming space, standing without apologizing. Each part was written with surprising softness. Plain language, clean layouts, margins filled with stick figure illustrations showing kids gripping microphones with shaking hands, then standing taller panel by panel. One diagram showed a child holding a cardboard sign that read, Your voice is not a guest here, it belongs. There were handouts too, printable worksheets, group prompts, even role-play scenarios. Some had messy handwritten notes in the margins. Might be too abstract. Ask Elise? Add breathing technique here. Used to help me. Page 7, personal story. Not sure if too much. I turned to the back page. Taped there delicately was a photo, a candid one I didn't remember taking. It was from the first week of the program. The kids were all crowded around a table, hands midair, laughing at something out of frame. In the corner of the image, only half visible, was me, smiling, really smiling. Hair tied back, sleeves rolled, caught mid-laugh. It felt like watching myself without armor, written below in pencil. They saw her before I did. I closed the folder slowly, both hands pressed against the cover. There were no apologies in the pages, no confessions, no rewritten history. But there was something better, understanding, a kind of witnessing only possible when someone stops needing to defend their version of the past, and instead honors the truth that survived it. The next day, I printed a dozen copies of the guide. I stacked them in the community resource bin next to the entrance, right under the sign that read, "Take what you need, leave what you can." Later that week, I saw Zay flipping through one, then Amber, then two more students who rarely spoke above a whisper during group check-ins. By the following Monday, they were all gone. That afternoon, after a messy paint and collage session, I found Adrianne in the back office reorganizing a drawer full of ink pens. "They took all of them," I said, holding up the empty bin. She turned, surprised. "Already?" "Every single one." She smiled, wider than usual, but still not performative. "Guess I'll print more." There was a pause between us, comfortable. "You could teach a full workshop," I said casually. She raised an eyebrow. "Me? Teach? I was always the worst at school presentations." "Exactly," I replied. "They'll believe you." Adrianne looked at me for a long moment, her hands frozen over a row of highlighters. "You think it matters?" "It already does." She nodded, once, then turned back to the drawer. Not in dismissal, in trust. Later that evening, after the students had left and the lights dimmed to a gentle hum, I sat at my desk again with the original folder in front of me. I ran my hand along the river stone she'd used to hold it down, the same stone I'd once picked up on a hike with Margot, years ago. We'd argued that day, me insisting I wasn't like Adrianne, her insisting that was the point. She handed me the stone before we walked back to the car and said, "You don't have to raise your voice to leave a mark. Sometimes, you just need to press into the earth and let the shape speak for you." Adrianne had never heard that story, but somehow she had done exactly that. And this time, finally, I let myself feel it. Not anger, not even relief. Just quiet, full-hearted gratitude. It was never supposed to be this big. The forgotten frame had begun as an act of defiance, my quiet response to years of silence. But over time, the silence had become symphony. Somehow, what started as a dusty old studio with peeling paint and a broken easel turned into something alive. The transformation didn't happen overnight. At first, it was just me, a few folding chairs, and a shaky hope that someone, anyone, might show up. Then came Tyler, the teenager who used to sketch monsters in his math notebook. Then Nora, who barely spoke but painted galaxies on recycled cardboard. Then Mrs. Ellis from the corner bakery, who donated leftover cupcakes for the kids' art days. And then one Thursday afternoon I walked in to find a line outside the door. A line. Amber, our ever-optimistic volunteer coordinator, waved at me through the glass. "We've got 2 school groups booked and a wait list for Saturday's clay class. We're gonna need more tables." I laughed, a real full laugh that startled me. "And maybe more walls." We tore down the old supply closet and turned it into an open gallery space. I painted it myself, pale gray with a soft blush undertone, colors that felt like breathing again. The walls filled quickly. Students' works were raw, imperfect, bursting with life. One corner was dedicated to anonymous pieces, titled Only with Emotions, Grief in Green, Safe Here, My Mother's Silence. Sometimes I stood there late at night, alone, staring at them. Not to judge, not to curate, just to listen. It wasn't just the kids who came back. Parents lingered, retirees offered to mentor, high schoolers stayed late to organize supplies. We had poetry nights, dance workshops, and impromptu jam sessions that shook the floorboards. And then one Saturday, Adrianne showed up, not with her entourage or her ever-hovering assistant, just her. a scarf in her hair, minimal makeup, holding 2 large boxes. "I brought some art books," she said, eyes avoiding mine. "Thought your kids might use them." I nodded slowly. "Thanks." She didn't ask to come in, but I stepped aside. That day, she spent an hour in the gallery. She didn't say much, just stood in front of a piece done by one of our shyest students. It was a mess of color and movement, with a single line written in gold ink. "I don't want to disappear." I glanced at Adrianne, expecting distance, but instead she whispered, "I remember that feeling." Weeks passed, and so did a quiet shift. We got featured in a local paper. Donations trickled in, a grant came through, a documentary student asked to film our story. At first I resisted. I wasn't ready to be seen, but then I remembered what Margot had once told me. You don't need to scream to be heard. You just need to speak in your own tone. So I said yes. The documentary was short, just 8 minutes, but it spread. People emailed, called, showed up, some with money, some with brushes, most with stories. One man, mid-60s, approached me after a class. "I haven't held a pencil since I was 12, he said, "but this place, it reminds me that it's never too late." I smiled. That's exactly the point. There was one day, right before our first community festival, when I stayed back to lock up. The studio was empty, lights dimmed, but something caught my eye near the bulletin board. It was a mosaic, not large, just 8 by 8. Muted purples, dusty blues, fragments of ceramic that shimmered softly under the lamplight. In the center, a gold square. Underneath it, a handwritten note, taped delicately. "This is for the people who rebuild what was broken, even when it wasn't theirs to fix." No signature. But I knew it was Adrianne, and instead of bitterness, I felt something else rise in me. Pride. Not just for her, for me, for choosing to stay, to grow, to build. That night, I lit a single candle under the mosaic. I whispered aloud, as if Margot were leaning over my shoulder, "I think you'd like what this place became." Then I walked to the door, flipped the light switch, and left the studio humming with all the voices, brushstrokes, and stories we had created, together. It was raining that morning, the kind of steady, whispering drizzle that made everything feel slower, softer, like the world had taken a deep breath and asked me to pause. I had arrived early at the Forgotten Frame to prep for our weekend showcase. The studio smelled like sawdust and acrylic, comforting, grounding. As I opened the mailbox perched crookedly on our fence post, I found it there. A simple cream envelope, no return address. My name, Elise, written in that unmistakable looping cursive I hadn't seen since childhood. My breath caught. I didn't open it right away. I tucked it between the pages of the attendance clipboard, heart pounding. For the next hour, I pretended I wasn't aching to know what was inside. I helped a teenager mount her collage, taped name tags on easels, and laughed with one of the volunteers about the splatter paint mess in room B. But I kept touching the envelope, absently, nervously, like it might disappear if I waited too long. Finally, when the hallway was empty and the light from the east windows spilled golden across the studio floor, I sat on the bench by Margot's mosaic and opened the letter. No greeting, no sign-off. Just a single sheet of thick textured paper, her favorite kind. And her voice, there on the page. I used to think strength was being chosen first. That art was only real when it was on a wall in a museum or auctioned under a spotlight. I fought to be seen, Elise. I fought to win, not realizing I was losing pieces of myself in the process. And I didn't see you. Not really. Not when you showed up with your quiet sketches. Not when you sat in the back during every family gathering, never interrupting. You were like negative space in our family, always there but never allowed to define the composition. When grandmother passed and her final work was unveiled, I felt something crack open inside me. I thought it would be triumph. Instead, it was shame. Her last piece was about you, not me. It's taken me all this time to understand what that meant. She didn't choose you because she pitied you. She chose you because you listened, because you loved without needing an audience, because you saw people, really saw them, even when they didn't see you. You turned a decaying studio into a home for the forgotten. You've taught people that their stories matter, even if they're told in whispers. That healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just someone saying, "You belong here." You did what none of us could do. You broke the cycle. I envy you, and I admire you more than you'll ever know. This isn't an apology. I think we both know it's too late for that. But it is a thank you for carrying something I was too proud to hold, for doing it with grace I didn't deserve. You were the better artist all along, and I see that now. By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling. The rain had slowed to a mist outside, the kind that coated windows in a sheer veil. I leaned my forehead against the glass and closed my eyes. I didn't cry, not out of coldness, but because the ache had softened into something else. Something I couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness, not closure, but maybe recognition. A long overdue reckoning wrapped in a letter with no name. I folded the paper and slipped it into a frame, not to hang, not to display, just to keep. A quiet acknowledgement tucked away behind my desk like a fossil, proof that something once lived and changed and tried. Later that day, I found a small slip of paper stuck under the front mat. A quote, handwritten in the same looping script. "Some flowers bloom in the dark. That doesn't make them less beautiful." No signature. But it didn't need one, I knew. And this time, I whispered something back. "Thank you." It was the first day of spring. The forgotten frame buzzed with quiet energy, laughter echoing in the main hall, paint-stained hands holding mugs of cocoa, and paper cranes hanging from the rafters like dreams in flight. The front windows were wide open, letting in the scent of hyacinths from the courtyard, and the sunlight streamed across the floor in warm, shifting squares. At the heart of it all stood the new mosaic wall. I had worked on it for months. Not alone, never alone. Each tile was placed by a student, a volunteer, a mother, a child, a veteran who once said he didn't belong anywhere. It was made of discarded glass, chipped ceramics, and broken mirror fragments Margot had saved in a dusty box labeled simply "Future." Now that future had arrived. The mosaic stretched across the studio's central wall, vibrant and impossible to ignore. It didn't follow any traditional pattern. Instead, it looked like a burst of light, shattered pieces, somehow holding each other together. A constellation of pain and healing and joy. In the center was a frame, empty. Just golden trim and soft lighting behind it, a space left open on purpose. People gathered around, whispering, some confused. And then Ava, one of our teenage students with blue hair and a cracked voice, stepped forward. "Who's the frame for?" she asked. I looked at her, then at the others. My throat tightened, but not from fear anymore. "It's for whoever needs it," I said. "Anyone who's ever felt invisible, unseen, unheard. This frame belongs to them." A hush fell over the room, the kind that settles when something sacred is shared. And then, one by one, people started placing things inside. A paper flower, a sketch, a thank you note, a photograph, even a wrinkled candy wrapper someone said reminded them of their mom. No names, no plaques, just presence. I stood back, hands dusted with grout, watching it all unfold. Adrianne wasn't there, at least not physically, but I saw her note again in my mind. Some flowers bloom in the dark. Maybe this was hers, too. A quiet offering left in the light. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, I stayed behind. I sat on the bench by the mosaic, shoes off, toes pressed against the cool studio floor. The room smelled of clay and old wood. Margot's studio, my studio now, and for the first time I let myself feel it fully. Pride, not the kind that shouts, the kind that hums inside your chest, like a steady heartbeat reminding you that you're here, and you've earned your place. They told me I was too quiet, too forgettable, too soft, and for a long time I believed them. I believed that only loud things mattered, only the framed portraits, the grand speeches, the shining names carved in marble. But here's what I've learned. Softness isn't weakness, and silence isn't absence. There's power in choosing to see others, in holding space, in building something not for applause, but for healing. My grandmother saw me, even when no one else did. Not because I fought to be seen, but because I stayed. I stayed kind. I stayed honest. I stayed whole. This mosaic, it isn't about me. It's about us. All of us. The misfits. The overlooked. The quietly resilient. We're not broken. We're rearranged. And sometimes when the light hits just right, that's when we shine the most. She stood and turned off the lights, except for the one above the golden frame. The soft glow reflected off each shard of glass, casting rainbow flecks across the room. A quiet kind of magic. The kind built, not inherited. The kind that lasts. If Elise's journey moved you, don't let her message end here. Like this story, share it with someone who needs to be reminded they matter. Subscribe for more stories of healing, truth, and quiet transformation. And comment below. When was the moment you finally felt seen?